Today is a particularly important discussion, and it brings back to me the importance of citizenship and where are we in this participation of building South Africa and building the infrastructure which is bound and grounded in IT. And I think the way the talk's going to go today is really interesting for me because we can strip away some of the sales talk and get to what people are going through. And we've got a great guest in Ntlantla who's coming through, who has got experience from the coalface and is still hip deep in the work. And he's joined by Aslam, who I'll introduce before the panel discussion. But right now we're going to dive into Gigi, who is an adventurer of note in the South African context. And if you are on LinkedIn and want to follow someone who makes you quite jealous about my sedentary life and where I live in 4 ways and go to work at the customers around South Africa, follow Gigi for a view of South Africa as you haven't seen it before. Gigi is going to take us on a journey of understanding and experiencing outside of my comfort zone, specifically around what is happening in the real world of South Africa for most of our citizens and who we serve from a public sector perspective and where we should be looking when our conscience is tweaked. Every now and then we get to dive into it, but he's showing what an exciting world it is. Gigi, I hope that's a good intro to where you're going to take us today. Over to you.
So, morning everyone. So I'm going to be talking about garcinomics, which is in essence a term I coined to describe the economy of the informal sector, which to a large extent is an unseen part of our economy and yet is a massive part of our economy, as I'll show just now. But in many ways, it's the future of the economies of Africa and even more importantly in South Africa. And one of the books I wrote was called Garcinomic Revolution because there is a revolution happening in the sector. And this revolution is not a low-tech or a low-income revolution. It's high-tech. It's a sector which, as I'll show you, is very vibrant, but more importantly, is starting to emerge as one of the key parts of our economy. I grew up in a place called Msinga in KwaZulu-Natal. Msinga was, when I grew up, the poorest district of South Africa, and today is still that. And in fact, lots of people used to say to me, where is Msinga? And I used to struggle to say where it is. Now I tell people it's right next to Nkandla. So you now know where Msinga is. And my parents were political activists and they believed the only way to change people's lives was to live like them. So they built a mud hut with no running water, no electricity. And we grew up as Zulu kids. My primary skills are stick fighting or goat herding. I'm not sure which has been better for me in business. And we grew up like that. We felt we were incredibly underprivileged. We walked to the river to wash. And in fact, my mother still lives in Msinga in the same mud hut and still walks down to the river to wash. She refuses to have running water or electricity. We grew up speaking the language, learning about the culture, and we kind of felt we were hugely underprivileged. And kind of when we visited white people in town, they had toys and TV and things like that, which we never had. In fact, if we went to town and we had meat, we used to say, what died? Because the only time we had meat was when some animal died. And we were very poor and yet rich in culture and experiences. And the first time I really realized the huge benefit of growing up like that, I moved to Johannesburg. In Msinga, they call it Kwandonga Ziyaduma, which means the place where the walls thunder. And of course, Johannesburg is a very scary place if you grew up in Msinga. Anyway, I moved to Joburg and I was in a Pick n Pay writing out a check. And the lady behind the counter said to the lady who was packing my bags, she said in Zulu, which means look at this white person, he's got hair like a baboon. And she was talking about my arms, not my head, as you can see. So I said nothing and I wrote out the check and I tore it out and I gave it to her. And I said, as I gave it to her, I said, have you ever seen a baboon writing out a check? With which she screamed and she said, sorry, boss. So I said, sing manje, so I've gone from baboon to bass, with which she fled and she stood behind this pillar saying, sorry, boss, sorry, boss. And I thought it was, of course, very funny. And the word spread from till to till as everyone told each other the story and the whole place came to a standstill. And so the manager had to come and finish my transaction. And as I left, everyone was still laughing. And I realized the huge benefits of growing up in this space was really not about speaking the language, because many people speak different languages and many more than I'd speak. But it was really about understanding deeper things about our society, about understanding lifestyle, understanding humor, understanding sarcasm and irony. And these are the things that in essence shape our communication. And to a large extent, we don't know enough about these and interact with each other on this basis. But one of the other benefits I had about learning this was understanding that there was this massive informal sector. And Msinga is famous for being the largest dagga growing region in the country and exporting their dagga to Johannesburg and Durban and so on. And this kind of opened my eyes to this massive informal economy. And within the informal economy, we have these massive misperceptions. We believe they, and particularly, the kind of public sector and government and municipalities often kind of see this as a nuisance. They see the sector as survivalist and subsistence businesses, which is a real sad misconception. As an example, in the top left there, this lady, I called her Gogo Delicious. She sells amagwinya or vetkoek in downtown Joburg and Van Willig Street, and her and her husband sell 3,000 vetkoek every single day for R1 each. They also sell 500 rands worth of fish, polony, cheese slices, tea, and coffee. So 6 days a week, they turn over 3,500 rand a day, of which their margin is about 50%. So they make around 1,500 rand a day, 6 days a week. And they've been doing this for 11 years. And they're building a 2-story house in Meadowlands in Soweto. And yet we walk past her and we kind of go, oh, shame. And yet she's actually earning a lot of money. So the picture in the center is a young lady from Limpopo who came to Johannesburg and she couldn't find a job. So she started selling amagwinya right across the street from Gogo Delicious. And she's 24, and today she sells 6,000 vetkoek every single day for R1 each, and about another 1,000 rands worth of cheese slices, tea and coffee, and so on. So she turns over 7,000 rand every single morning, 6 days a week, and she employs 4 staff, her brother and 3 others. And you can see the queue outside her little store there. So again, we walk past her and we cannot imagine that this young 24-year-old is making this money. And then on the lady on the right-hand side, she's selling at a school in Tembisa, and school kids in the township get given what's called ikeri, which is pocket money, and they buy snacks, lunch, and so on from ladies like this. And I was chatting to this lady, and I said to her, how long have you been selling here? She said, 26 years. I was like, 26 years sitting on that upturned bucket and plank. She said, I put 2 children through university selling from here, and my husband has been unemployed the entire time. So she earns about 6,500 rand a month in profit from her table, and she works 3 hours a day, first break, second break, and after school, and yet she earns this great amount of money. And I decided to test this whole idea that these people would grab a job at the drop of a hat if they could find a job. And I said to her, if you could find a job, would you take it? She said, what would I do, Ndodana? Would I come to your house and wash your underpants? And she put it perfectly into perspective. She could be a domestic worker traveling to my house, working for 8 hours and traveling home for an hour or so. And she would earn probably 3,500 rand a month, which is the minimum wage for a domestic. So people in this space are also not looking for other jobs. They're very happy with their jobs. They earn a good amount of money. And in many ways, their working experience is a very good one. This over here is called a quarter. It's a quarter loaf of bread with slap chips, polony, acha, and more recently a cheese slice. And as you can see, it's endorsed by the Heart Foundation, and it's banting friendly. Anyway, in 2005, I was asked by Parmalat to launch cheese slices into the townships. And at the time, black kids who were rich were called cheese boys or cheese girls because cheese didn't exist. And I suggested and then launched cheese slices into amagwinya or vetkoek and into quarters. And today, Parmalat turns over 2.5 billion rand a year just from cheese slices going into quarters and vetkoek. On the top left, there's a place called Spatlo Palace. A quarter in the north is called Spatlo. And there's a young 34-year-old called Telo who owns 8 of these in Pretoria, not in a township in central Pretoria, right next to the High Court. And Telo has 8 of these outlets. She's got guys on electric scooters who go delivering to all the government offices. She has a tuk-tuk that goes around. She has guys on bicycles going and delivering to Department of Education or to the court chambers and so on. And she sells 4,000 quarters every single day. The other day, she bought herself a Range Rover Velar for about 1.6 million rand cash. So it just gives you an idea again of the scale, and not just in the township space. In fact, when you buy a quarter, you buy the basic one for 12 rand, then you add an egg for 2 rand, and then a cheese slice for 2 rand, and so on and so forth. She said, when I bought this Range Rover, she said it was like a quarter. I kept saying, add this, and then you add that until I got to the one I wanted. So we have this massive sector, and if we look at the fast food sector, we have about 50,000 outlets turning over just under 90 billion rand a year in South Africa. Interestingly, we've heard a lot about the immigrant traders in the Spaza sector. These 50,000 outlets and about 200,000 employees of these outlets are all South Africans. South Africans will not buy prepared or hot food from an immigrant. And so we have a range of meal type from amapleti on the left there to chicken dust and hard body chicken, the kind of chicken Nando, KFC style, the quarters, and then the whole shisanyama, mohodu, and so on sector. A very vibrant sector competing with the formal sector very effectively. And in fact, this sector is growing faster than the formal fast food outlets. And just to give an idea, this is a youngster who contacted me called Kopano, who sent me an email and said, I would like you to mentor me. I'm selling food to fast food outlets in 3 suburbs in Soweto, and I'm using my late grandfather's Nissan 1400 bakkie, and I'm storing the stock in my grandmother's backroom in Soweto. And I introduced him to a range of manufacturers because he was looking to get cheaper products. And a whole bunch of people I introduced him said, you know, we really like what he's doing, but we can't really help one little guy. And I introduced him to a chicken supplier called Hume International in November last year. And the head of Hume International said, Kopano, I'll give you 100,000 Rand credit line on chicken, and I will sell you a Hilux bakkie with a refrigerated back, and you pay it off over 2 years. And that was in November. And by the end of January this year, Kopano was selling 2.5 tons of chicken to 31 chicken outlets every single week. And the guy from Hume International, the chicken supplier, said, Gigi, I need 999 Kopanos. Can you imagine the scale? So this is just to 31 outlets. Kopano is selling 2.5 tons of chicken, let alone all the packaging material, oil, flour, and so on. So this gives you an idea of the potential, and when you support an entrepreneur like a Kopano, how big this can potentially be. The other sector is the Spaza sector, dominated by immigrants, by 4 immigrant groups, Somalis, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Ethiopians. It's about 150 billion Rand sector. 85% of the sector is immigrants. It has been transformed dramatically by the arrival of the immigrants who have challenged the formal retail sector. Their primary competition has been with the ShopRites and Pick n Pays of the world. Interestingly, I mean, there's a lot of negative has often been spoken about the sector. They have 20 billion Rand a year in rental to South African homeowners. So this is an idea of the incomes that are also being generated because they never own the properties which they're trading from. And they've really changed the Spaza from this hole in the wall into a top right there, the Spazarettes, which are supermarket type outlets. And generally they're 5 to 10% cheaper or on par in pricing of the same branded items as ShopRite or Pick n Pay. So providing a great service in terms of well-priced products within walking distance of consumer homes, which has also been a benefit over the COVID time. The fruit and veg sector is another massive sector, and there's about 500,000 hawkers in South Africa who earn anything from 3 to 15,000 Rand per month profit. I mean, just to give an idea of the scale of this sector, the Joburg Fresh Produce Market, which is owned by the city of Joburg, turns over between 4 and 6 billion Rand a year, depends on the year you want to look at, 466 million Rand per month with 20,000 buyers. Of those buyers, 60% of those are informal traders, you know, the Gorta fish and chips outlets. And if you look at the sector, in fact, over lockdown, what happened was that the fruit and veg traders were not allowed to purchase from the market. And the market lost 40% of their business within those first 2 or 3 days that they were not able to trade. So just gives you an idea. But if you look on the bottom left there, This is a bakkie brigade that comes, and this was taken at 4 a.m. the other day at the city market. And this multitude of bakkies are collecting vegetables on behalf of the hawkers and then delivering the hawker and their goods. Can you imagine the opportunity as an aggregating opportunity? Well, there's no technology involved here. This is face-to-face, you know, and the city market doesn't get involved, or the city of Joburg, in terms of helping manage this kind of thing. The Uberization of this kind of transport and purchase behavior has massive opportunities and something we're not exploring. Another big sector is the backroom rental sector. If you look at South Africa, about 40% of our population is households consisting of a single person. The vast proportion of our households are formal dwellings, more than 80%, despite what media says. So we have this huge backroom rental sector worth 20 billion rand. So over and above that 25 odd billion rand that the Spaza rental, we have another 20 billion rand in backroom rental. And again, how do you find backroom rental room? You walk down the road and think, "Any room and funny room," whatever it might be. Imagine again if we had an Airbnb type opportunity in terms of networking these, or where rental was paid on some form of platform that developed a risk profile so that you could then borrow money and buy your own house, or you could borrow money to build more backrooms for yourself. So we have a huge range of dynamic economic sectors: internet cafes, the tavern sector, the taxi sector is 250,000 taxis in South Africa, the hair salon sector. So I'm not going to go into all of these. I don't have the time. The catering sector. And we don't recognize how big each one of these sectors are. They're all as big as the ones that are shown. So how did they respond to lockdown? Well, the fascinating thing on the top left there is a bakery in White City in Soweto. And the minute lockdown happened, what he did is that he put his menu on Facebook and he invited people to WhatsApp him their orders and their PIN location. And he had these guys with trolleys and umbrellas who could walk up to 15 kilometers going to deliver the bread. The same happened with the fruit and veg sector, because the taxi ranks were quiet as everyone moved onto these trolleys and were walking the streets selling with a little bicycle hooter and so on. And the fast food outlets like the Shisanyama's were only allowed to do delivery, did exactly the same. You can see on the bottom right, Bafokeng put that menu on Facebook and invited people to WhatsApp their order and send a location, and they would deliver the hot Shisanyama food. So a very quick pivot to be able to adapt to technology and use technology. But the technology that is used to an extent is very much WhatsApp and Facebook, which I'll come to just now. The formal sector is very much about month end, but the interesting thing about the malls, and you can see these massive queues that happen over a month end. We have about 16 million people who queue up at malls to draw their social grants or COVID 350 Rand grant. And so we have these massive queues. But what the mall represents to a large extent is people come to the mall to update their apps and to use the free Wi-Fi in the mall. And so at month end, you update all your apps, you use the free Wi-Fi, and then, of course, you go home and you're operating within the informal sector from there. So let's just look quickly at digital. In Africa, it's very much not online and virtual. People do not trust internet. They trust WhatsApp and Facebook. I mean, it might seem crazy, but as you saw from the examples, WhatsApp is ubiquitous, Facebook is huge. And I think that the future is really going to be about WhatsApp and Facebook type technology, because data and airtime remain major limitations. And remember that also the Facebook people are using is Facebook Lite, which has a slightly different dynamic. So the real opportunities around free apps, use of free Wi-Fi, like in the malls and so on. If you look on the bottom left there, Hash Data Free is a fascinating platform. It has Moya Messenger, which is a WhatsApp type product, which is data free, but more importantly, has a range of opportunities for free data websites. On the right-hand side, there is an app called Malaysia.com, where Zimbabweans can order groceries. Instead of sending money to your family in Bulawayo, you can send them groceries, and you order the groceries on this app using Q codes. It's a fascinating product. And as I said, in terms of free Wi-Fi, the picture in the center is what are called in the township bum fences. And these guys are all reaching inside to a community center that has free Wi-Fi. So they have their arms inside the fence, getting the free Wi-Fi inside there. And so I really believe the real opportunities are in providing either data-free or low data apps or reverse billings, and there's a huge amount of opportunity around there.
Sure.
And then also looking at WhatsApp and Facebook-based kind of e-commerce. So really in ending, define your strategy around a new world. I think to a large extent we get directed to believe what we believe around either historical data. I mean, I showed you that 40% of our population are small households, and yet we hear all the time how big township households are. That was true 20 years ago. It's changed dramatically. And we get driven by anecdotal media bias. We hear a story and we believe that transfers. So the second thing is that demographics have changed. It's about rapid urbanization. Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent. South Africa has about an 85% urbanization. It's about crowded transports, smaller households, and people on mobile apps. And then the real opportunities are about aggregating effects and opportunities. How do we use aggregating effects? And going back to the earlier question around, for instance, what governments and co can do, the first thing we have to do is we have to recognize these are businesses, because to a large extent, we walk past that gogo who's selling amagwenya or that kota outlet, and we do not see that these are real businesses, and we have to respect them as that. And the Minister of Small Business, not the current one, the previous one, was quoted as saying, we need more entrepreneurs in the township. That is absolute rubbish. We have the entrepreneurs out there. We need to recognize them and support them. We also need tech-based models which allow us to do two things. The one is this aggregating effect of using technology, for instance, to allow 1,000 hawkers or 20,000 vegetable traders to be able to aggregate their orders and get better deals. The second part about it is that how do we finance them? Most of these businesses desperately need cash flow financing or financing to grow their business, to enlarge their quarter outlet or whatever it might be. And they cannot get loans from government. They cannot get loans from any commercial or public sources because there's no track record of them. There's no geographic position stuff. And I wrote extensively about stuff done in East Africa using technology, where you can build a profile. And in fact, the city of Joburg put together a very impressive platform for hawkers to register over the lockdown period because, there were these queues of hawkers trying to register, and they built this very quickly. It's an example of recognizing, A, that there's a business sector here, and B, building technology-based platforms. People have no resistance to technology. They have a resistance to data costs, but no resistance to it. There's a very quick move into WhatsApp and so on. And so to a large extent, the informal economy is not yet tech-driven. And we need to look at tech solutions to these, using geolocations in terms of how we identify them, building databases of where these are. If, for instance, a municipality doesn't know how many traders there are in a certain area, then of course they're not going to plan for them. And if they don't know how important they are to that economy. So how do we build these payment and ordering systems, geolocations, databases, and so on? And I think only in that way are we really going to, A, participate in this garcinomic revolution, but more importantly, we need to stimulate this. There's a very interesting report done by the International Finance Corporation called the SMME Voice. And what they show there is that the average time that an informal business has been in business is 6 years. The mean average is 6 years. So these are not transient businesses that have been there. The second thing they show is that the vast proportion of these businesses are looking for ability to grow their businesses. And they're generally not able to do that because they have no rights to the land that they're operating on. They have no title deed for that home. So they do not invest in those businesses. And this is a big opportunity. The third kind of thing that came out of it is this lack of technology in the space, of enabling technology that allows people, whether that's access to a point of sale system that helps me manage my stock, an ordering system, a way to get a loan, and each one of these things. And in Rwanda, it takes 4 days to register a business. In South Africa, it takes 40 days. That just tells you why businesses in South Africa do not register and yet could be registering, as an example.
And the only people losing is our tax system, actually. if we get registered and we get it quicker, we get the tax income that's coming through, which is building the infrastructure and building the country for sustainability. The question has been posed through a number of Q&A questions that we've got is, how do we formalize these businesses to make them sustainable? Or does that governance almost clamp down on them so that they can't?
So I think the important thing is that there's a perception that these businesses do not want to enter the formal economy because they don't want to pay tax, which I don't believe is true. And there's no incentive for them to join the formal system, and there's no incentive for them to register. There are, however, experiences like the Warwick Street Triangle in Durban, where the hawkers pay between 80 and 120 Rand a square meter to the city for their piece of pavement. And that's actually, if you consider cost, it's actually quite expensive, and yet they happily pay this. So there are examples of this. And if you look at all of these traders are paying VAT on their purchases, and it's a net benefit to the fiscus because they don't claim this VAT. So we mustn't ignore that kind of benefit to this. If the incentive was that if you were trading on the street in downtown Johannesburg and you would have the rights to trade from that piece of street, very much like a hot dog vendor in New York, and no one was about to kick you off the street, trust me, you would register tomorrow and you would pay your taxes or your rental or whatever it might be. Nothing like that exists in this country. What we try and do is we try and move people to centralized markets away from the footfall. And again, it would be like moving a hot dog vendor in the streets of Times Square in New York and saying, no, you've got to move 3 streets back to where we've built a place for you.
I am with you 100%. My father works in Portugal on the street, and he's got his section of the street and he pays tax for that section. And no one will take that away from him because he's paid for it and he's got the right to it. Gigi, where do we learn more? One of the attendees asked, are you going to share your slides? I don't think you are, but where can we hear more? Because we're going to get into the formal sector now onto our panel.
The starting point is probably Garcinomic Revolution, which is my latest book, and it's an audio and electronic as well as physical. You can get exclusive books, whatever. There's a lot of info on there. I have my website's gigialcock.com, and I have my email and everything there. Feel free to drop me an email.
Attendees, I would really encourage you to go on to Gigi's website and start from there. You've put a challenge down for me to read Garcinomics. I'm up for the challenge because you've got audio, so I can do it while I'm running. He's already formal. Look, he wore the formal sector. So we are joined on a panel to discuss our public sector challenges. And we've got Aslam from SUSE, who is the public sector lead. So he is the boss of the area. But in addition to that, he is the CIO of the Department of Science and Technology, an EXCO member of Government IT Officers Council, and a chair for Open Source Committee. And Nhlanhla is both an academic and a practical leader, sitting on a number of boards. He's in the work environment, hip deep in doing work. And I've got a couple of tough questions that we're going to be asking you, if you don't mind. And I'm going to dive into Nhlanhla, and I'm looking at you and just moving it there. The staff turnover and loss of critical employee know-how in public sector seems to be a common thing. How do you keep folk in your environment so that you don't have a drop in service?
Tricky one, Daniel. I think the one part that keeps folk is the fact that some of the people in the environment are really committed to their work. Okay. They love the people they provide services to. And when you listen to the type of stuff that we've just heard from Gigi, people then get inspired by those experiences. So there are many people who would share those experiences, and that drives them. The other reason, though, is kind of a bit more negative. Unemployment is high. Many companies, especially in the private sector, are not as accommodating to some of the young South Africans, women, Black people, as they should. So you find that many people find a home in the public sector and don't have many choices. So there are people who stay, not because they really are committed, or they might be committed, but there are things that will push them away and opportunities are limited. Having said that, there are people who still live. Recently we lost one of our best talents, and you find that it's hard to replace them, not because people are not out there that can be replaced, but because, again, funding constraints makes it hard to easily replace those jobs.
I think that's a tough thing. One of my customers had a vacancy for 42 weeks in an IT area just because we can't find the critical employee. It's terrible. Aslam, you're not getting off the hook. What do you think is our biggest challenge to servicing citizens in the digital world? Because you get to go to a number of public sector environments. Is there a common thread throughout?
Yeah, so when I speak to my public sector customers and colleagues, the message I give to them is, how do you simplify your environment? How do you modernize? And how do you accelerate innovation in your space? And the reason why we always have a discussion around these points is this has always been the challenges faced by the public sector. Okay. A review was done back in 1998 by the Presidential Review Commission. And they found that in government, the systems were just too complex. Every piece of technology out there, government was running it. And that's why it's a great place to work. Working in government is great because there isn't a piece of technology, that you won't come across if you work in government. So you have a wide skill. But that was also part of the challenge, that because you had such a wide array of technologies running in your environment, you needed a very wide skill base to look after all of those technologies.
Yeah.
So you have systems that don't speak to each other. You've got this huge technical depth because you've got you've got legacy systems. So you could go into any department and find a system that's 20 years old, 25 years old, even 30 years old, right? And the challenge is, how do you modernize those environments? And part of the challenges around modernizing those environments are not just technology, it's around budget, it's a way those technologies are licensed, and also the skills to manage those environments.
Would you summarize the biggest challenge facing IT in public sector right now as unscrupulous salespeople?
No.
Okay. So it's not that we're selling them stuff that they don't need. It's that there's a challenge around the fact that there's such a myriad of proprietary software out there. I want you to pause because I want Nhlanhla, you had a bit of a chuckle out there. You had a different answer from that. Nhlanhla, do you think that us as IT salespeople and partners have been a little bit disingenuous to public sector and just sold them whatever's on our price list? Or do you think that the challenge is architecting solutions for you guys?
Thanks, yeah. No, I think it's a combination. I think some of you have been unscrupulous, as we hear from the Zondo Commission and everything. And some of you have, done the right thing. I think Aslam will tell you that back in his days as CIO, it was hard to solutions that aligned with government policies. Government would say one thing and companies would do the opposite. And when companies like SUSE and others started emerging, for instance, they made the open source model more fashionable because for some people, they needed to hear a big brand before they could buy in. But yeah, I think there is a little element. But architecting the solutions is another part of it, certainly.
So in the 80s, there was a saying, no one will get fired for going with IBM. I think a lot of people go from a brand perspective, whereas the open source gives us a lot less lock-in, which is brilliant. And Nhlanhla, when you've got the challenges of reading about your department in public sector on the front page of the newspaper, hearing about the leakage that we got, how do you keep your staff motivated and focused on creating digital citizens?
Yeah, again, it's a hard one. On the one hand, maybe I should take a bit of a remote example where one entity got attacked. And there was a hack. And when we spoke to the team from a different organization that was working on that, their response was, but we've been telling them about this for a long time. So you find that some of these negative headlines, much as they may be demotivating, they sometimes lead to people in the lower ranks who are often ignored, finally being vindicated to say, guys, listen, if you keep doing this, these are the consequences. So maybe if you listen, these headlines will start, reducing in number.
Excellent. I really like that from a citizen perspective. Aslam, again, coming back to it, what do you think is the biggest challenge that's facing IT departments at the moment? because we've got the mandate from public sector, we understand where the vision is. Is it achieving that, or is it finding the technology to do it? What do you think is the challenges that you're coming across again and again and again?
Definitely skills is one area that we do find challenges.
How do we get the skills uplifted in public sector?
Well, you're asking an open source person here, so I'm going to go with the open source as an option. And it links very nicely with what Gigi was saying about garcinomics. Because back in 2007, we had Cabinet adopt an open source policy. And what they wanted to know is, how does this help us build the IT industry? And they also wanted to know, will open source actually harm our current IT industry? And the answer is obviously yes, open source can be used to build the economy. And for some players who have a very closed model, it's going to harm them as well. But when it comes to skills, open source does offer a unique opportunity that you can have access to the best software in the world. And as someone who's trying to build skills, even if you're not employed, you can join an open source project and start learning. So the open source model does offer a lot of opportunity for people to get involved in IT projects, from a very entry level all the way up. Recently we had a South African that's now part of a very big project, the Debian project, and he's now a contributor on the Debian project. So we're seeing that throughout, we're able to participate and get involved in some of the best software projects in the world. And that's an area where we need to probably spend more effort and get more people involved in.
So maybe Ntlantla's philosophy of training staff up needs to be one of them that's embraced by public sector. Public sector in my humble opinion, had to do a couple of things: provide infrastructure for us to work, provide safety that we can sleep at night, and create an environment for making people better at what they do. So their citizen development. And maybe there's a question, which is the high turnover rate in public sector. Is it worth it to train my staff? With upgrading my solutions, or is it better to go for solutions that don't need much management? But maybe the angle is, actually, in Ntlantla, your job is to create people for the private sector, for entrepreneurship, and you're a training station as well as a public sector environment. Any comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think you've summed up, but I think there's another thing that may help me answer by saying that, and somewhat in disagreement slightly with Aslam, in that there are skills. And I think what Gigi was saying earlier about being located in the right places, so where he grew up, the types of insights that you develop just based on where you were. So some years ago, when Aslam was, I think, involved in this as well, we started arguing that many of these state entities should be based in the townships, in the rural areas. What then happens is the skills will find you if you are there, as opposed to you having to try and go and find the skills. And therefore, it partly then answers this question whether you should worry about upskilling or not. My argument is that many of the people with skills are sitting out there, but have been left out of the system. Data costs and physical access and not being connected maybe to areas of information about new opportunities leads to people being left out. But if organizations like SUSE, imagine if some of your offices were not in 4 ways, but in Msinga, imagine what would come out of that.
Yeah, there was those mobile coding schools that were up and about and teaching people from vans, and I'm not sure where that's gone. I'm hoping that's going on, because when you go to the Eastern Cape and you see people farming like it's the 15th century, we should all hang our heads. We should really all hang our heads. Carl Joubert made a comment, which is not enough open source development is taking place. How do we bring open source into the DTRC's Digital Hubs program, Aslam?
So I think this links back to what Ntlantla was saying, that we really have an opportunity of innovation without permission. You don't have to ask for permission. There's no barrier. Part of the challenge around why do we have so much legacy in government is that Achilles heel of procurement. So yes, Ntlantla alluded to some unscrupulous salesmen, but even, procurement has been an Achilles heel for government departments. It's how do they get the best solution in place? So often some departments have had this strategy that you touched on, which is we only buy best of suite. So we go green from the hardware all the way up to the software. Everything is green or everything is red. And, we buy the best of that suite. Then, I've had CIOs tell me that, they only buy best of breed technologies. But that means also that they're then investing in a silo. So one of our ministers famously said, you need to connect the dots. And for me, it's really about what allows us to connect the platforms, the infrastructure, the technology. How do we make sure that systems speak to each other? How do we make sure that there aren't these issues around interoperability, that we're not building the silos that we did in the past? So if you look at a lot of government infrastructure, we build silos. We have systems that can't speak to each other. So, there was a strategy in 2005 around an integrated financial management system so that we can have systems that can actually speak to each other and, add efficiency to government. But coming back to the question, I think the challenge is really that we don't need permission to do a lot of this innovation. And Ntlantla is saying that, the skills are there. They just need to be given the opportunity. So one of the challenges that Gigi raised up is just access to the digital space. How do we make sure that we're building an inclusive digital society, that everyone has access to it? Because right now, what seems to be an unfair advantage to the places we live in is that fiber and broadband access is much easier and much cheaper available to us. And it's much more expensive in other areas of our country. So if government wants to go on this e-government strategy, how does it make sure that it brings and takes everyone along with the strategy? It doesn't help us to build the best e-government solutions when people can't access those services.
Is that not half of our problem on the innovation side, is that we want to be all inclusive? I mean, should we not have a digital citizenship in Sandton that can happen rapidly and we get that return and then we roll out to the areas? Or do we have to wait in order to make it happen in Sandton until we've got fiber to the Eastern Cape?
It's hard to say where to. Well, actually, I think it's easy. So you're saying start in Sandton and then roll out elsewhere?
No, I'm just saying start with, we don't have to wait for the whole program to be in place. Start with what we can start with. Innovate with where we can innovate. Stop, we have meetings about meetings. And I think sometimes this world-class objective, which was in the public sector mandate, is held back because we've got to have a world-class committee to get a world-class agreement on a world-class something, and we never do anything. And I'm being very facetious here, but
no, I absolutely agree. So start where we can. Yeah,
that's not good for me. We can't agree. We're on a panel, man. Tanya said that we are building more silos than ever before because our systems are fragmented. How do we overcome this, and how do we overcome this empire building within public sector? It happens in the formal sector as well, in the private sector. How do we overcome this? What is your strategy for that, Ntlantla?
Again, I think two things. The one is lowering the barriers to access to the solutions, to the technologies. Makes it easier then for people to then contribute. So the reason I'm really happy that we started this panel with the garcinomics background discussion is that I think the answer lies in there. That what you'd have are people coming in, doing the little they can, and then ours is to integrate what is out there. So if you get to a bus stop, for instance, you'd have everyone coming and offering their own little solution, but they're sitting next to each other, and somewhere in there's an ecosystem that develops. So you could find that the silos would disappear if the participants in the ecosystem are given access to then come and bring out their talent, their skills, their wares, their solutions. So I think maybe we need a longer session, but I think the whole garcinomics model is exciting, and I haven't read the book. Someone actually did use it for their master's studies this year. So I think it would be good to see how that helps us answer your question, but I think we could find some answers there, reducing the barriers to access.
Aslam, while you are heavily invested in public sector as well, you have the privilege of standing out and watching it. Are you seeing a cultural shift in your public sector clients, that they're embracing this, like, we've got stuff to do, let's go and do it? Or is there still a resistance to change and we siloing in and trying to stay out of the news?
So definitely there's a great drive. And interestingly enough, it's coming from a tough place. We're seeing IT budgets being cut drastically. So part of this innovation is not necessarily that we want to innovate, but we're forced to innovate. It's how do we drive this innovation and reduce costs? But also we're seeing a citizen that's much more sophisticated. They used to WhatsApp, Facebook, they used to this digital experience. And now the expectation is, how do I get that when I engage with government as well? So the challenge is really, from a government perspective, is I have access to private cloud, to public cloud. I have some systems on premise. And how do I build a solution that's actually future-proof, that whenever I invest in any technology, that I get the best return of that investment? So I think part of the public sector challenge is also that public sector has invested a lot of money in technology, but has not always seen the return out of that investment. We haven't seen better service delivery. What we've seen is just maybe a hodgepodge of disparate systems and not the improved service delivery we expected from, say, e-government solutions. So it comes back to this technology that we're investing in. How do we make sure that it actually translates into better public service delivery? And now we have these solutions around, cloud just allows us to build solutions in the cloud. And the challenge for the public sector people is really, how do I build something that's sort of digital native? I'm not taking my old locked-in system that was on-prem and just putting that same system that locks me in the cloud. I get no value out of doing that. So it's really about changing the way I operate these technologies around DevOps, that I'm continuously improving and I'm continuously developing a solution.
I think this talk and the CASI economics could carry on for hours. I really think SUSE is busy changing the way public sector is looked at, and it's an attractive place for people to come and work. I think that if we've got leaders like Nhlanhla who are flying the flag, I think those centers of excellence are just going to grow, and I'm hoping the ripple effect just raises the bar from a public sector perspective, because as everybody on this call, it's in our interest to have a strong, innovative, secure, professional public sector. There are a number of questions on the chat that are still going on. Our SUSE team is going to take those questions and going to respond to our folks. We are out of time. Nhlanhla, thank you for giving us your time and your experience. Aslam, thank you very much. And I really appreciate everything that both of you are doing just to raise the bar from an individual perspective in public sector and make it a place where people want to build careers and stay and build the country.